we will learn more about what the economic future might be in our to-be inaugurated U.S. administration. We have with us Professor Dr. Max Otte, who is a published author. He wrote, among other things, The Crash Will Come, and which dealt with the U.S. subprime problem that was our economic crisis in 2007. Professor Otte took his Abitur at the Albert Schweitzer Gymnasium in Pottenberg. He then went on ultimately to receive a PhD in Princeton, worked in Boston, has returned to Germany, but in the interim became a U.S. citizen, among other things. And he is here to discuss what the Trump administration shall look like, in particular dealing with U.S.-European relations after Trump. And I perceive from the dinner conversation this will be perhaps the first event I've been to where things are not put in a negative tone in general. So with that, Professor Otte, may I give you the podium here, and I will sit down and shut up like I should most of the time.
Well, let's not get entangled here with the various microphones. I'm really happy and pleased to be here. Tom Leeser and my good friend David Nauer, who I've known for 22, 3, 4 years. Done many things together. So thank you for inviting me again. And yes, it's about U.S.-European relations with Donald Trump. And yes, where should I start? You want to expect some outlook from me. So maybe I start with my record as a prognosticator, as a forecaster. And I liked Norbert Walter. He was a great guy. We were in Washington together from 86 to 87. He had Brookings. I had the Institute for International Economics. He was a young professor. I was a student. But Deutsche Bank Research, half a year before the crash, said everything is fine. So, and then half a year after the crash, they said, we're going to crash. This is what economists normally do. And if you look at the forecast, this is really what's happening most of the time. So I wrote this book in 2006, The Crash Will Come, and I had a secular theory of the world economy, a long cycle theory, which I'm going to come back to today. And I said, we'll have a big crash sometime between 2007 and 2010, maybe most likely 2008. Then I did another thing, which was my lecture, my job talk at Boston University from from April 1998. It's on record with the American Council on Germany, so it's the working paper 1998, number 5, and I talk about the euro and the future of the European Union. And I said the euro is going to last for about 10 years. After that, there's going to be big problems. And we'll have, I'm going to come back to this paper. So those are the two big forecasts I made. And then there's another one I made on ZDF after Obama was elected the first time. And they asked me what is going to happen now. And I said, well, he may have some of the right ideas, but he will change exactly nothing. Because he has no home base, he has no power, he has no any force to get things through. And this is what happened. This is at least my reading of it. Nothing much changed. Of course, you could always argue it could get much worse. Well, we don't know this. This is a counterfactual test of history. But not much really changed. Okay, so this is me as a forecaster. The secret of good forecast. I'm very happy I don't run a research institute or a forecasting institute, because if you have to come up with a forecast every half year, you're going to fail. The good thing about, or the important thing about forecasts is make them only when you have a fair degree of confidence. You can do that only if you're not paid for them. So that's one of the secrets of the trade. So we go to our president-elect, and I must admit I had a slight sympathy for him. So I'm coming out up front. A sympathy that has deepened since then. And I will explain why and what the reason is and the implications of this. First, I show you this. This is his book, The Art of the Deal, which my friend Marco Brockhaus, head of Brockhaus Private Equity here in Frankfurt, gave me in 1987. Dear Max, a present from America for your future business dealings. So this is how long this man has been around, and my suspicion is that, not suspicion, I think there are facts to corroborate this, that really he has thought about public service pretty much all his life. I mean, he started putting out ads in the New York Times in the early mid-80s. So this is not something that came by accident. The president-elect has waited for the right time, and then he has made a bid and he won. And because the German press was even more negative on Trump than the American press, way more so. And there was literally no dissenting voice. I thought I should listen to 4 hours or 5 of Trump's speeches on YouTube. You can do that these days. And what I listened to made sense. He was somebody who the German press and also the American press called him a divider. I don't think so. He calls himself a unifier. What he did was he pointed to a fact that there's some deep divisions in American society, and that some big problems which neither of the establishment candidates would recognize. And you have to address them and tell that they're there before you can address them. There's the racial unrest, there is the poverty, there's the public debt. All these things were put out pretty bluntly in the speeches. And of course, this is something the establishment doesn't like. I noticed the deep divisions first in 2005 when I was part of an international conference in Kiel, where we had a conference on international affairs, and there was a Democratic and a Republican professor there. And the whole 3 days, those two kept fighting pretty bitterly. And I thought, wait a minute, that's what Europeans are supposed to do. This is not the American way. But so this was the first time I saw there's deep divisions, and those need to be healed. Those need to be overcome. And then we have, of course, the family history that also, although you cannot have somebody more American than Donald Trump, I mean, he does have ties to Europe. His mother comes from a very poor Scottish family. She must have been a wonderful mother, and then the grandfather, of course, as we know, is from close to here. So there are those ties. So let me go a bit into deep stuff of history, philosophy of history. And there's another figure that is very controversial, who is, take two of my notes. No, there they are. There is a Steve Bannon, who was also, of course, the press points very negatively. So let's get a first-hand impression of that person. And so listen to a talk by Steve Bannon, a 211 talk 2 days ago. 30 minutes. I didn't have so much time to go deeper into it, but he was a very smart guy who talked on a philosophical level. I mean, there's Breitbart News, but I should also disclose that I run something not quite like Breitbart News, but I run a, let's say, grassroots stock letter, and I know people who run grassroots media sites in Germany, so I'm not unsympathetic to that either. So I listened to Steve Bannon, and I heard that he is influenced by Strauss and Howe, two thinkers who wrote about the cycles of American history and the turnings in American history way back even to England. And they have a theory of generations that influence American history. This also got me to think of Arthur Meyer Schlesinger, the Democratic historian, the Kennedy historian, who wrote his book, The Cycles of American History in '86. And I was there at American University when he presented it, because I was there to study for a year. And Arthur Meyer Schlesinger, before I come back to Bannon, to Strauss and Howe, said we have cycles in American history that swing, or the pendulum swings between the private interest and the public purpose. So Roosevelt, public purpose. 20s, private interest. 60s into the 70s, public purpose. After that, private interest. So don't expect, this is one thing, don't expect history to be linear. History is cyclical, or history at least has huge swings. And we're at the point that I think we have such a swing. And let me quote some of the things that Strauss and Howe say, because they are seemingly the major influence on Steve Bannon, and he of course is now chief strategist. So let me get some quotes from their books. There's turnings in history, and they have a first turning, a high and upbeat era of strengthening institutions, the 50s, weakening individualism when a new civic order implants and the old values regime decays. Second turning is an awakening, a passionate era of spiritual upheaval when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. The third, and this may sound familiar, is an unraveling, a downcast era of strengthening individualism, a weakening institutions when the old civic order decays and the new values regimes implants. And the fourth turning is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval when the values regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. And according to Strauss and Howe, who wrote this in 1997, so it's been a while. It's been a while they wrote this, and I find them remarkably accurate. We're now in crisis mode, and we've been in crisis mode since '05. I mean, we can't really, the crisis started really in '01, it got deeper in '07 and '08, and nothing really changed. Nothing changed under Obama, nothing changed under the presidents before. I mean, George Bush realized crisis mode, but nothing really changed in politics. I mean, we all talk about change, but there was no change. Then he has a generations theory, different generations, and their order propel those. Prophet generation, nomad generation, hero generation, artist generation. So the boomers are now getting into the age group where they are prophet generation. And the succeeding generation is always, the third succeeding is a hero generation. The prophets lead the heroes. Anyway, this is a bit complicated. I won't go too deeply into it. It takes two readings. But we are in a period where we have the prophet generation as the elder leaders, like the president-elect, and we have the heroes, which are very different from the baby boomers, which are very different. They are a generation that is ready to work, go to work, strengthen institutions, go forward, and that's the constellation at least Strauss and Howe see. Also, they say that we shouldn't think about history as linear. This is a big trap. I mean, we think we have a trajectory, and that trajectory continues on. It's not the case. Trajectories get broken. We have swings in history, we have accidents, but we also have swings that can be predicted. And it's not so much the swing or the events themselves, but the way society responds to them. And that's the question of generations. So let me talk about those responses. Let me quote Strauss and Howe. During a fourth turning, generational forces tend to funnel exogenous events towards a concerted national response. When Hitler and Tojo launched their global aggressions, America was poised for decisive action. But when the same thing happened with the sinking of the Lusitania, it took 2 or 3 years until America got working. So it's a different how society views those events and how it reacts. Let me talk about this fourth turning, and I agree we're in that. We have a rupture of history. We have a true rupture, one that probably we had in some ways with the New Deal, which had many applaudable things. Institutions got strengthened. It was a good time for America. It was a democratic era. It's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's about deeper things. So what does Strauss and Howe say? Well, they say, before long, America's old civic order will seem ruined beyond despair. People will feel like a magnet has passed over society's disk drive, blanking out the social contract, wiping out old deals, clearing the books of vast unpayable promises to which people have once felt entitled. I mean, isn't that the entitlements that the boomer generation is looking forward to? The economy could reach a trough that may look to be the start of a depression. Well, we're in that. With American weakness newly exposed, foreign dangers could erupt. Soon after the catalyst, a national election will produce a sweeping political realignment. As one faction or coalition capitalizes on a new public demand for decisive action. Republicans, Democrats, or perhaps a new party will decisively win the long partisan tug of war, ending the era of split government that has lasted through 4 decades of awakening and unraveling. The winners will now have the power to pursue the most potent, less incrementalist agenda about which they had long dreamt and against which the adversaries had darkly warned. This new regime will enthrone itself for the duration of the crisis. Regardless of its ideology, that new leadership will assert public authority and demand private sacrifice. Where leaders had once been inclined to alleviate societal pressures, they will now aggravate them to command the nation's attention. The regeneracy will be solidly underway. So much Strauss and Howe. And also the strengthening of institutions is somewhat an irony of history that this may happen now. In the current unraveling, pluralism and free markets are both very popular. The seasonal rhythm implies that the popularity of both is now cresting. Where America back in the high, pre-seasonal thinking would suggest pushing for more of both. Today, however, pre-seasonal thinking suggests preparing for less of both. Since, come the fourth turning, America will no longer be as hospitable to we first lobbies and me first free agents. As the speculum turns, their day will ultimately come again, albeit not until the middle of the 21st century. So, I mean, this is deep stuff. This is pretty potent stuff. We don't know if it's happened, but it derives from a pretty deep view of history to which I happen to concur with mostly. Influenced by a German philosopher called Oswald Spengler, who also thought about the cycles of history, who in turn influenced Henry Kissinger and Paul Nitze and the like. So this may happen. I mean, we may indeed be at the threshold of something quite different. And one final quote from them: "Don't think you can escape the fourth turning the way you might today distance yourself from news, national politics, or even taxes you don't feel like paying. History warns that a crisis will reshape the basic social and economic environment that you now take for granted. The fourth turning necessitates the death and rebirth of social order. It's the ultimate rite of passage for an entire people, requiring a liminal state of sheer chaos, whose nature and duration no one can predict. Well, we have chaos to some extent right now. So, I mean, this is deep stuff, but this is the stuff that apparently Steve Bannon has read. So let's look at the US in the world system. I have 2 or 3 more points. The US is the undisputed world leader. We are on a stage where China is rising, and intelligent balances and deals have to be struck. The previous globalist, interventionist elite wanted to be everywhere and picked pretty much every fight there was. Now that's probably a bit much when one looks at the world order as it stands today, and it was very reassuring for me, I mean, to hear the president-elect talk about reconciliation with Russia. Because there's Russia, there's China, there's many other spots on the globe, and if you take them on all, this might be a bit much. And as a European, who I'm also, I would very much hope that we stop the deep divisions in Europe. So, but there's those hegemonic cycles that my professor at Boston University, Robert Gilpin, talked about, and we're also there in a dangerous situation where we have rising powers, especially China, and where the US's resources are fairly stretched. So that's also, those were in history were times ripe with dangers and accidents. Europe, on the other hand, and I'm sorry and sad to say, still doesn't have a phone number, as Henry Kissinger used to say in '73. It's pretty much very divided. It doesn't have a sense of geopolitics as Americans and Chinese and maybe Russians to some extent have. Europe is basically still a collection of nations plus Brussels. Brzezinski talked about whoever controls the heartland controls the world. For whoever controls the Eurasian continent, he did that in his book on geopolitics in the late 90s. And the pivot, the key was Ukraine. But the question is it so smart to really create unrest there, or should we respect spheres of influence? And I think the president-elect has given some clear indication that he does want to do that, because in the Middle East there's way deeper dangers that one has to address. Europe is being destabilized and doesn't do much about it through unrest at its fringes, be it the Middle East, be it Eastern Europe. And of course a destabilized, frightened Europe is it's not really a partner you want to have. Of course, then you have people like George Friedman of Stratfor, who openly says that the goal of US policy for the past 100 years was it to prevent a Russian-German close alliance. So, but I mean, in the end, I think that the US, Russia, that's all, I mean, in terms of the dangers that the world faces, we're pretty close, and we should try to minimize divisions. And I think the president-elect has given some indication that he wants to do that. And the appointment of Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor is a good indication that this is one of the lines of grand strategy he wants to pursue. And I completely, as a German and American citizen, American and German citizen, would very much hope so, this to be the case. Because as the president-elect was vilified in the press, so is another statesman a little out to the east who I met once and who is a very rational president of his country. So we'll see how far Europe goes. In my paper, The Euro and the Future of the European Union of '98, on record I wrote, when we have this crisis in Europe, when the euro develops severe problems because it's just not the right construction for Europe, we'll have a sweeping reform in Europe, we'll get a democratic European Union. Well, let's wait and see. I mean, Brussels is still fairly entrenched. There's 10,000 people in Brussels who earn more than the British Prime Minister, Theresa May. So it's just too comfortable to, let's say, a parking spot for politicians. So Europe fights back, and it fights back, the European Union fights back. Let me read 2 or 3 quotes from Gabor Steingart, the editor-in-chief of the Handelsblatt. And he puts it very nicely, and he's not really in nowhere one is further away from Europe than in Brussels. Doubts, to doubt the EU is to doubt God. Institutions that nobody knows function according to mechanisms that nobody understands. So that's his view on Europe, and I happen to agree on the European Union, because Europe could be a much better and more viable partner if that union gave way to a more democratic union. And maybe the election of Donald Trump does foreshadow some changes in Europe too. So let's look at the refreshing new style of leadership. I was, let's say, smiling when I read the last tweet. I mean, I talked to David about this. Maybe the tweets at some point have to stop during the presidency, but we don't know. But it's a nice and new way to communicate with the public. And there was a tweet that Boeing was charging too much for Air Force One. The $4 billion is too much. I mean, whenever has a president done this? This was considered to be no presidential, but it's absolutely right. I mean, Washington has become a place where you can just present your bill and you get it paid. I mean, so I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And then the media was talking about how he makes the Apprentice 2.0 with the candidates for the Office of Secretary of State. Well, I mean, that's a way of communicating. It's a transparent process. That's what we want, don't we? I mean, so it has its charms. And the appointments I found I mean, I'm sitting here in Germany with my company, with my asset management company, with my media company. I'm in the US not that often, so David Nauer is much more the person to know what's going on, but I'm observing and the appointments that have been made. I mean, of course, I think Michael Flynn is a wonderful choice. Reconciliation with Russia is just what we need. I think, and I gave you some of the quotes, that Steve Bannon at least is a deep thinker about the deep recurrence of history. There's some very skilled operators. I think those are very encouraging and smart personal choices. So at least that's my cut. So let me end at this point with a quote or a saying of one of my heroes. As an investor, I look to fundamental investing, to Warren Buffett. I've been in Omaha a couple of times, and he, of course, was a huge supporter of Hillary Clinton. He's been Democrat all his life, and he's saying the nation must coalesce behind the president. That's it. Thank you very much.